Welcome, everybody. My name is Jeff Letterman. I work in Fish and Wildlife Outreach within Minnesota DNR, and this is the 133rd episode of the Minnesota Outdoors and Skills Stewardship Series. We're talking today about fall fishing tips and techniques. I went out last night. The weather is great. It's a beautiful time to be out, and we're really excited to have with us Scott Mackenthun and Eric Altena. They're two of our area fisheries supervisors, have a lot of experience with fishing and fish management across the state, but even more so, they're phenomenal anglers. So we're really excited to have them here to talk about their expertise and what they can share with us about fishing. So I'll let you guys say a little bit more, and then let's look at our poll results.
All right, thanks, Jeff. Yeah, we're excited to be here to talk a little bit about fall fishing. It's really a great time of year. As Jeff said, Eric and I are area supervisors, myself in Hutchinson and Eric at Little Falls. We do a little bit of fishing, and there's a lot to cover when you're talking about fall fishing. So I think we're going to kind of jump into a few things, and Eric's going to jump in when he wants to make a point. I'll do the same, but we've got some fun things to talk about. Some topics that are definitely in play when it comes to fall angling. And there's a little bit of science that backs this up too. So it's always fun to see that interplay in fish management and in angling and in fish biology. So unique kind of intersections of all of them. So like Jeff said, we'll drop some links for you folks, and we'll answer questions at the very end, and we'll go through quite a bit of content. So let's jump right into it. What are we going to cover today?
Scott, I'm going to see if Benji has some results he wants to share with us. Just posted them.
You bet. So talking about fall, I mean, very broadly, this is a big season of change. And when you think about that, that really is impacting organisms in a lot of different ways. We're going to kind of get into the brass tacks of what that means. We'll talk a little bit today about fall turnover because it is such a big element to things that happen on lake systems in Minnesota. We're going to talk a little bit about shore fishing. That's a big push within our agency, within the state of Minnesota, giving folks access to shore fishing opportunities and why we think it's important, especially in the fall. We'll talk a little bit about angling for lake sturgeon. We're going to cover walleye. We're going to cover a little bit on pike and musky. We'll talk a little bit about crappie, and we'll even spend a little bit of time. There's some really unique fisheries in the fall season on the north shore of Lake Superior. And we've got the expert here. We've got Eric to talk about some river fishing, smallmouth and largemouth bass angling, and he's got experience with all those other species as well. And then circle back to answering those questions and answers. So like we said, fall, it's a season with a lot of change, right? It's a lot of major changes going on, especially for organisms. Let me know, Eric, I mean, I can throw out a few too, but major changes that are occurring for organisms in the fall of the year, aquatic organisms.
Yes, certainly. We got vegetation that's disappearing. That's a big change. And obviously we talk about temperature. So certainly those are two major things, and your forage certainly makes different runs, and flows could be either high or low depending upon rain events. So there's a lot of those factors for sure.
Absolutely. Just veg coming down, water temp changes, a lot that's going on. Speaking of that, shoulder seasons are coming upon us, right? Spring and fall, we get a lot of weather instability. How does that affect the fish? When it is stable, it's definitely on a temperature declining trend as we switch from the summer period into the winter. So things are going to cool off gradually, but we do get those storm systems. We do get those big blows. We do get a little bit of instability. Here's a big one. We won't get into the specifics of the actual temperature ranges for individual fish, but part of where I think some of the great fall fishing comes up is that we're getting to this point that we have all these different species, and we're going to talk about a lot of them today. They all have varied temperature ranges, and many of them have this sort of optimal range where they're really in the sweet spot for foraging, for feeding. And that really lines up well with consumption, and you know, anglers are out there and they're going to encounter those fish that are really feeding and putting the feed bag on. So nice temperature ranges to settle into in the fall. An obvious one for anybody that wants to enjoy the beauty of nature is just to get out there this time of year, right? It's as pretty as the landscape is, why so many of us have backgrounds that show fall pictures. A real big one for a lot of folks, if you don't like crowding that you might see in the summertime, is the boat traffic is way down, right? Maybe you're going with the family to the pumpkin patch or apple picking, or the kids are in school, or you're watching the football game, whatever it might be, or you just don't want to be out when it's that cold. The boat traffic goes way down. I think a big one. What do you think about this one, Eric? Is this your excuse?
Yes, definitely. It is tough. I'm a big bow hunter too, so for me it's pretty tough to, sometimes find enough time to get out fishing at the same time as trying to spend some time in the trees. So there's no question that it is a competing season with a lot of different things. Obviously, if you're a waterfowl hunter, that's a big deal. If you like small game or grouse or pheasants or something too, I mean, those all come up. So
Absolutely, hunting seasons definitely compete during fishing in the fall, and I think, like Eric said, there's just that scarcity. You only get so many days to do the waterfowl, the upland birds, deer hunting, etc. And then one of the last ones for that whole season of change is fall turnover. So let's get into that real quick. We get a lot of questions at our office, and I'm sure a lot of area offices do. Our info line receives this one pretty regularly, is talking about fall turnover in lakes. So we're not going to do a huge, get down to every little detail. It'll be sort of a general overview, but I'll go through it a little bit with you folks. On deep lakes, this occurs on deep lakes, and we're talking about Minnesota has, oh boy, 11,482 lakes that are over 10 acres in size, right? So we've got a lot of lakes here. Now, they have to be a certain depth. Let's say 15 to 20 feet, for example, or a certain size that they're able to stratify. So Minnesota's got a lot of dimictic lakes. That means they set up and mix twice per year. And we see this layering in the summer months, right? That's called stratification. You're going to find 3 layers. At the very top, you're going to find the epilimnion. That's where the warm and well oxygenated layer is found. That middle layer is called the metalimnion, also called the thermocline, where we have it's a little belt in the middle of the lake that temperature and oxygen varies rapidly. And then below these 2 layers is the hypolimnion, which is the coldest layer with the least amount of oxygen. And this layering really is reinforced by biological processes. You think about where light penetration, the limits of light penetration are, which then limits it's called the photic zone, where plants grow and where they can photosynthesize. So light doesn't go that far down. Photosynthesis doesn't occur in the hypolimnion. Organic materials settle out into the deep water areas, starts to break down, and that decomposition uses up oxygen. So you start to get the picture of why these lakes build up and stratify with the different layers of water. So now let's think about the fall. As the fall starts, the length of daylight shrinks and the nights become cooler, and that's going to chill surface waters. Eric and I spend a lot of time on electrofishing boats in the fall as we're sampling fish at the end of the growing season. And we can have those nights that start off really warm and you could just about be in t-shirts, and by the end of the season, you're throwing on your parka and you're seeing a lot of fog on the water, where you get that difference between air temperature and water temperature. So it definitely happens. As those fall days and nights come in, things cool off, the waters actually cool and their density changes. So as they become cooler and more dense, they start to sink to the bottom. And we get this this exchange basically starts to happen. Our metalimnion starts to shrink, and eventually you start to see some regulating of temperature. Both those temperatures, they're not so drastically different. You can kind of see it in our picture here. The hypolimnion will warm up, the metalimnion will cool down, and that metalimnion, or that thermocline, shrinks and shrinks and shrinks. Then we start to get these big wind blows, right? We've seen those if you're a waterfowl hunter. You love to see when the wind's blowing hard, especially from the north, to bring in new flights of ducks, but that's also affecting our lakes. It's mixing, and that wave action is enough to actually disturb and break down, finally forcing this turnover and switching. And what you'll see is it's usually below 60 degrees. There's not an exact temperature because it varies. A lot of times it needs that wind and wave action. But you get into the upper 50s or below, you're often seeing turnover in effect. And then you'll really know when it has happened, when you'll often see some sediments or organic materials. A lot of times people see bryophytes for the first time. They're these really cool plant organisms that come up off the bottom. And the lakes can temporarily be more turbid and lower in oxygen after turnover. And it'll just stay cool through those 50s after turnover into the 40s, all the way down to this magic number of 39 degrees Fahrenheit. We'll keep equal temperature throughout the lake. 39 is where water is most dense and it holds the most oxygen at that point. So you will see that as an angler on your depth finder when you're into the mid 50s, say, or below, that we're going to know that turnover has occurred. Everything is the same temperature. And why is turnover on lakes important? Well, the general trend is fish move shallower in the fall, but at some point they will reverse course and head a little bit deeper. And post turnover, after our lakes turnover, they can really be found about anywhere in the lake once the oxygen is stabilized. So they're no longer limited by, is there enough available oxygen? So you get this really great push, and this is speaking very generally about our fish species. You get this really great push as temperatures start to drop, fish are going shallow, but after turnover, then they can move out and disperse, go elsewhere, and it really makes for unpredictable and tough fishing until those fish get adjusted to post turnover. Eric, you got a good story of fishing the lake after turnover?
Yeah, it can be pretty difficult. It's like you get to that magical temperature, and honestly, you can be on a lake. It's right at that 60-degree mark or whatever, and you might have terrific fishing for 20 minutes or something, and you might hit a hot spot, and all of a sudden, bam! It's just like things totally flipped overnight, and you can't even buy a bite after that. So, I mean, obviously, our electrofishing is not as I guess specific to needing the fish to cooperate like that, but certainly we know that the fish move up shallow during the fall. I mean, we see that from our electrofishing. I've known it from angling as well. So definitely that's something that's evident.
Right on. So like I mentioned, definitely want to plug shore fishing in Minnesota. It's a great opportunity. There's really not a better time than in the fall. Shallow opportunities are best for anglers in the spring and the fall when the water temperatures are kind of in those low range. And we're seeing fish move shallow in the spring for spawning purposes. In the fall, it's more tracking their prey. We'll talk a little bit about some of those prey items in different fish species, but really utilize our links and resources for finding fishing piers, shore fishing areas, and available parklands. There's amazing opportunities for urban users. Minneapolis is the land, is the city of lakes. We've got lots of lake resources, even across the whole 7-county metro area, and realistically across the entire state. Besides so many lake resources, we've got streams as well. So take advantage of that great shallow water fishing that occurs here in the fall. So let's talk about a few different fish species that you can really tie into and have some success with in the fall. A big one to lead with, lake sturgeon, very popular fall fishery. This is a spring and fall species, in my opinion, where a lot of people will target them. And the two fisheries that are most popular are the St. Croix and Rainy River. So when it comes to fishing for lake sturgeon and where and when you can do so, you're going to want to consult the border water section of the Minnesota fishing regulations. We'll throw a link up for that. Pages 61 is for the Rainy, pages 68 is for the St. Croix. So you can pick up on season dates, when catch and release angling is open, that sort of thing. Realistically, you're fishing with really heavy equipment, but very sensitive tips of the rod that can feel the slightest vibrations. Why is that? Well, lake sturgeon really use those mouths. I'm holding up this fish, and you can kind of see it in the world of fishery science. We talk about inferior position mouths on lake sturgeon, meaning they're entirely underneath the body of the fish. It's kind of like a giant vacuum cleaner. You can see it protruding there, just able to suck things directly up into the mouth. And they're opportunistic. They'll grab whatever they can seasonally, whatever materials they can find, plant or animal. So important species really depends on the water body, but in our major river systems that have gizzard shad, that's a really big one, because there's so much natural mortality that we're always losing a certain number of these shad. They're naturally dying. They're falling to the bottom of lakes or rivers, and these things are just vacuuming them up. Same thing with high abundance of emerald shiners like the Rainy River. They are important. So your bait choices, you have to follow suit. Something you're presenting on the bottom behind a sinker to hold it pinned down, and maybe a circle hook to catch that fish. Fathead minnows are a good choice. Shiners, night crawlers, you can get night crawlers and use those. And then legally obtained gizzard shad. So because gizzard shad are planktivorous, they don't have large mouths, they're not going to bite on a hook. So we have a unique thing for anglers in Minnesota who want to target lake sturgeon. We have a cast net permitting program. You can get a permit to use a cast net. They're otherwise illegal in the state of Minnesota for very specific uses for catching gizzard shad on certain water bodies. We'll throw the link in for the cast net permit application. You can go out and catch your own bait with a cast net. I'll warn you, if you're brand new to it, throwing a cast net is quite challenging. You need to be able to find these pods of fish, these schools of gizzard shad, and throw on top of them. But with some experience, some help, or even a mentor, or learning some information online, YouTube, you can be good at it, and then you can have fresh bait that you can use just on the water that night with your permit and you having a tagged cast net. So something to examine if you are interested in lake sturgeon. We'll talk a little bit about walleye. So big one. They're going to follow prey items to predictable locations. I've got this photo from our friends at Lake of the Woods Tourism. That is a picture from the Rainy River of their emerald shiner run that happens in the fall. It's not a spawning run. Rather, it's just a seasonal, regular thing that sort of happens every year. And it's noted by locals, kind of part of the phenology and the changing of the seasons. These shiners make this run, and you can predictably guess what happens next. Lots of fish following them to feed on those shiners. Any good, give me a good story, Eric, if you ever come across electrofishing, fishing, or otherwise, just big concentrations of prey fish in the fall.
Absolutely. It's crazy. There are times, I mean, we were just out on lake the other day, and in midday there was a bunch of perch and bluegill that were just kind of concentrated right in those shallow areas. And not to say that that happens everywhere or anytime, but and then shad, I've run into that in other states where I've worked as well. But yeah, where that you can see concentrations that are pretty amazing, especially during the fall.
Just a few weeks ago, I was fishing on Lake Bemidji with some advanced forward-facing sonar, and you could actually just see balls and balls of yellow perch. And then when you'd throw a jig down, you could corroborate that. You'd pull it up, and there'd be giant schools of these perch chasing your jig around. And then off in the distance, you could see these lone predatory fish, walleyes and bass and pike that were kind of working through these clouds. Of course, the fish were kind of buffering and trying to leave a 3-foot gap. So interesting predator prey behavior that's occurring right now in the fall. And you can take advantage of that, those concentrated fish up shallow. So big techniques, popular techniques, I should say, pitching jigs to structure weed lines, current seams, holes or pools by late fall in stream systems. A real big one, full moon crankbait trolling, right? The fish seem to be really active when there's more light out, or they're moving up shallower. It could just be a nighttime thing. The full moon may or may not help, but for whatever reason, it seems to work. But you can pick up a lot of fish trolling crankbaits around structure in the fall, in full moons. Again, just the same idea. Where are you taking advantage of those fishing opportunities? Well, if you're again back on rivers, this is true really any time of year, but it works well in the fall too. Anytime that you've got moving water, any of us in the department that work with fish on a regular basis would tell you moving water definitely attracts fish. So fishing inlets, creek mouths after fall rains can be very productive. And here's an interesting one. Fishing frog patterns in wetland areas when the fall amphibian migration is on, right? So these frogs and salamanders are moving to wetlands and to lakes and rivers to burrow down into the sediments and hibernate, and fish take advantage. This is a photo from a friend of mine over at the South Dakota Fishing Guide webpage. You can see all of the frogs that were picked up in one of his clients' walleyes that was caught. Just an amazing assortment of leopard frogs in there. So absolutely a pattern that can work. So if you're driving on roads at night and you're seeing all the frogs jumping over the road, they're making their fall migration, you probably know it's time to get out to the lake and throw the Kermit the Frog lure at them. Let's talk a little bit about northern pike and muskellunge, right? So these fish attain some of the largest weights of the season in the fall. Very serious pike and muskie anglers really target the fall period. They know these fish are gorging ahead of the winter. And when we get into large lakes that have deep water habitats, these fish are keying in on Cisco. So tell me about Cisco there, Eric.
Yeah.
You
I
got some
wish I
Cisco
could, but
lakes,
no.
don't you? Do you have
Yeah,
a
we
Cisco
do.
lake?
We have a few Cisco lakes, but yeah, they're actually spawning. This is one of the few that are spawning right before the ice goes up. So they'll move on to those shallow shoals and try and do their spawning activities. Usually these rocky shoals in some of our lakes that are a little bit more on the deeper side. They have the better water quality. They tend to have some of that typical uh, pattern that you were talking about with the whole mixing thing, right? So they become stratified pretty severely during the summertime, and that when they start mixing, there's no question that the Cisco are, that they're available for fish to be able to eat a little bit more readily after the turnover does occur. So
Awesome. And that's a good plug that we'll say we've got a Cisco talk coming up next week here on the Moss Seminar Series.
there you go.
A fascinating fish that really fuels amazing fishing opportunities for the fish itself and for recreational netting, but also just the importance in the food pyramid, how they really prop up our amazing fisheries for predator fish like pike and musky, like walleye, like lake trout, etc. So learn more about the fish itself, learn what we're doing to manage those populations and how we're taking care of upland habitats and watersheds to better protect ourselves for Ciscos in the future. So yeah, back to pike and musky. Like Eric just said, an amazing fish that spawns in November, late in the year, late in the fall, and it draws those big fish in. So 2 years ago, Nolan Springler caught our new by weight, largest by weight muskie in the history of the state. So an amazing accomplishment and something we've anticipated for some time to really see that fish come in, just an amazing one. And we'll throw a few other examples at you here. Here's a picture courtesy of Nicole Stone, who's been getting on some really great crappie fishing lately. So fall period, these crappies, they're going to stay out in scattered schools in the summer months, but they really start to group up. Those smaller schools kind of come together. They are going to move deeper and suspend. And a lot of times, folks that are very avid crappie anglers in the winter months, many of them are targeting deep holes to find those fish. Already in the fall, we've got crappie schools that are forming adjacent to those wintering areas. So seeking out these fish as they suspend, definitely there's something to be said about only taking what you need as an angler, really not spending a lot of time fishing deep and trying to catch and release these fish, but you can find them in a few places, again, finding them over deep water in holes suspended, or like other panfish where you find green vegetation. That's going to continue through the winter months, right? We do actually have some native plant species that it's variable from north to south and lake specific, but some of them can stay up and stay green well into the fall and even through the winter. And as long as you've got good looking green vegetation, it's good cover. It holds aquatic insects, it holds bait fish. It's great cover and it's great source for feeding for crappie. Another really unique angling opportunity is anywhere along the North Shore. It's Lake Superior itself. It's fall's a great time for fishing on Superior, but also its tributaries. I think in particular, this is the time of year when pink salmon are running. So you can get after those fish as well. Yes, there are runs of Chinooks and cohos. However, on the Minnesota side, we've got very low numbers of those. That's usually an incidental catch. But the pinks are a little better known because they're abundant enough and there's certain waters that they really collect in. Also a great time of year for catching rainbow trout again. Anytime it rains up on that giant rock on the north shore of Lake Superior, it's a good time to get on the tributaries into the mouths out on the lake and fish. So it's excellent fishing for lake trout as they come shallow to spawn. However, the season for lake trout, because of that spawning activity, the season does close after the first Sunday in October. So today is the 11th of October. The lake trout season is already closed. I'm going to turn the keys to the presentation over to Eric here, and we're going to talk a little bit about fall transition fishing on river systems.
Yeah. So speaking of water coming into a lake, I mean, that's not much different than we start talking about river systems. Moving water is a little bit different. Fish do migrate quite a bit. And one of the things that I kind of am talking about, and I'm going to have to apologize, Scott's actually doing the driving on the presentation. So he's going to get a cue from me or whatever to move on so we can take the next slide. So what I like to do is kind of as a fisheries manager and biologist, we kind of are fortunate that, yeah, we get to study stuff. And then it's also kind of neat to apply, or at least try to apply it to our angling skills. And I think one of the things I was fortunate enough to be able to do is participate in a telemetry study for smallmouth bass. And this is on the Mississippi River between St. Cloud and Coon Rapids. And one of the things that we know, just even from smallmouth bass, and this is shown in the literature for all species, I mean, particularly species like sturgeon, walleye, obviously all the red horse and the sucker species, they all migrate in river systems. And just to look at smallmouth in particular, migration, they can move up to 16 miles basically downstream to winter. So it's pretty amazing when you start thinking about that fish could have been 20 miles away darn near, and there's studies that even suggest up to 70 miles one-way distance to move to a wintering habitat. We'll hit the next one. So what we're looking at here, this is basically a classification of all the different habitat type, or the narrowed down types of habitats that we found in the telemetry study. And when you look at the different times of year, so on the bottom axis we have the months, and then on the top or on the left axis we have the percent of time that was spent there from all the locations that were gathered. And we had, I don't know, 2,500 or 3,000 some odd locations that we got from smallmouth bass throughout this study. So one of the things that you see is that pools become more important as the water cools. So noting that red line goes up during the late fall and in through the early spring, and then all of a sudden stuff like runs and eddies are more important. So basically a pool is defined as someplace that has a lack of current, not necessarily the deepest. So that's one thing to think about. It if you're a river fisherman, which by the way have an awful lot of public accesses to them that are available. There's some great opportunities that are not that far from public access areas and parks and all that along the entire Mississippi River for sure. Hit the next one. So this one, you're looking at the movement periods. This is based on, again, smallmouth bass in the Mississippi River between St. Cloud and Coon Rapids, and the temperatures are there to show you that the peak movements occurred are right around that October 17th time frame at 53.6 degrees. Okay, so that's kind of interesting when you think about it, that they don't necessarily move right away. Some will, there's no question. And we see that if you fish in the Mississippi River at all, fish will concentrate in certain times. And this time of year, when they're moving a lot, it's best to cover a lot of water. We'll talk about that here in a second. But basically, they can make long distance run in a short amount of time. And here, just picking on some of those examples. And again, this is sort of melding the biology with the angling, is that I'm kind of curious where that fish spent most of its time. And sure enough, the summer home range was down near Clearwater. That's that bottom red points there. The winter home range was up by St. Cloud Dam. And then during the spring, that fish spawned not too far from there. So basically, it started out where we captured it in the summer, moved down or up, in this case, all the way up to St. Cloud Dam to winter, moved down to the spawning location, and then back to the summer home range, all in just a matter of less than 6 months. So it's pretty amazing when you start thinking about that. We'll hit the next one. Another example of that kind of shows that if you have the habitat present, maybe they won't move that far. This was kind of a homebody fish. His identification was 671, right? So most of his points were found right there in that center middle with the red points. And then those green dots are kind of the wintering areas, as well as right in that general vicinity is where he spent most of the winter. So it's a small area. It's not more than maybe a quarter mile apart from those areas. This was just a summer shot. Obviously, that's not fall, walking in shorts in a field, actually tracking a fish in shallow water. The message there is they're trying to find food. And when the food is available in shallow water, that's where they'll be. And that definitely does occur in the fall as well.
And yeah, I think you were saying too, Eric, that little, where that inset picture is, that you had tracked a lot of fish in there that were taking advantage of some movements of minnows. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. And that was kind of a unique thing for sure. And that does also happen in the fall. If we get flooding events in the fall, fish will move shallow to follow that bait. So if there's minnows up there, there generally be game fish behind them. So basically, the message is that smallmouth bass, as well as other species, are very mobile. Mean annual range of about that 8.5 miles or so, but anywhere between 1.25 miles to 34 miles. They make long migrations during spring, which is no surprise, to spawn, and then even in the fall as well. So most smallmouth bass used eddies and pools, runs, and that varied seasonally. Well, makes sense when you think about a river system. It's dynamic. You got the current, you got the temperature. You obviously have vegetation that is there or not, depending upon what type of habitat's there, the rocks and everything that are available, depending upon flows. So it's all pretty variable, and that's what's really important to realize with river systems. Basically, we're going to skip down to the short, move a short distance or move a long distance in a short time, basically about a mile a day, which is pretty amazing. That can be either upstream or downstream. I mean, think downstream would be pretty easy, but upstream is a different story, and that's kind of something to think about when you're fall fishing. So how does all this help me catch smallmouth? We'll kind of bump through these. Basically, what you want to do is make sure you're thinking about the habitat that you're looking at. So whether that's a run, a riffle, a pool, an eddy, those areas are all important to fish, how the fish uses those things. And it's not just for smallmouth. I mean, they can help us identify some habitats for others, but the energy that they consume just trying to maintain existence in a river is something that often gets overlooked. And that's why we don't typically or don't expect to see something like a state record smallmouth come from the Mississippi River. They might get long, but generally they're not nearly as chunky as those fish that are found in lakes that don't have to expend that same amount of energy. Next. So one of the things with the river, and this is true for trout fishing as well, and even in those inlet areas on Lake Superior, right? If you present a bait or an offering, they expect it to be coming from the upstream direction downstream, not the opposite, generally speaking. And that's what tends to trigger bites. Sometimes if you're, casting upstream and reeling downstream, even excessively fast. I've had good luck catching brown trout in streams in Colorado, as a matter of fact, burning a little spinner just right through a pool or whatever. I don't know if you've found anything like that, Scott.
Yeah, it reminds me of the saying that only dead fish swim with the flow. So yeah, you got to present them in a natural way.
That's right. We'll go ahead next. So basically, and this is probably true for most fishing tactics if you think about it, but it's especially true in the fall. Is basically you want to try and cover some water, then slow down when you finally do land a fish or you see something. And this is one of the tips that I can definitely give you. As the water clears here in the fall, that's a benefit to the angler because you can watch and fish and see if fish are actually following your bait and then determine whether or not they're interested or if they're just kind of following it, out of curiosity or what. So it's a benefit to be able to watch and focus on what your bait is doing, not just, randomly casting and not paying attention to what's going on.
So Eric's going to talk a little bit about 3 classes of baits to use.
Sure. So basically, to start with that, search baits, top waters, believe it or not, can be used even into the upper 40s. And this is for a variety of species. Even muskies can be caught, even into the mid 40s or lower with some top waters at times. Bass are definitely prone to top waters up in the upper 40s or whatever, but a lot of species will hit some top waters. We get some search baits like that swim jig or the spinner bait or even, crankbaits. Those are all baits that actually you can search for. You can go ahead, Scott. That's fine. Thank you, sir. So reaction baits might include something that has a buzzer on the top or a little bit more of a blade type configuration. Chatter baits are another one, or those vibrating jigs, basically. The other ones obviously are crankbaits. Those are pretty huge. And then even something a little bit more subtle might be those swim baits, so with little paddle tails. Those are very good at causing a reaction strike with a variety of species. Those are golden for walleye, for pike, and obviously for bass. So let's keep going. Once you find some fish, and this is the beauty about river fishing in particular, but this is also true for lake fishing, is that if you find a reaction or if you see a reaction from fish, basically if you can slow down using something like these stick worms or actual natural bait, we call them Ned rigs. There's a jig and crayfish or craw combinations, and even just straight up grubs work terrific this time of year. If you can kind of slow down, present to where you had some follows or those fish are actually showing up a little bit, and then kind of concentrate, and you'll end up basically scoring a little bit more than you normally would just by using that active bait all the time. So
How are you geared up?
How are we geared up? Well, it depends on what you're fishing for, but I would argue that my personal preference, at least for most river fish, you know, if we're talking about walleye, pike, and bass, for example, you want to use a heavy enough combination to pull fish out of whatever cover there is, whether that's rocks, whether it's wood, whether it's vegetation. And then use medium to medium heavy rods for both spinning and bait casting. This is generally for bass, but honestly, if you're a river fisherman and all, the fish they kind of have an angle for you, right? I mean, I don't know, Scott, you probably caught plenty of fish in the current, and it's pretty amazing how much leverage they can gain. So it's probably wise to use some larger equipment.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But Eric, what about those other species?
Well, walleye, they tend to favor pool tailouts. So they'll also going to migrate just like the bass do, but they tend to be, you know, in areas that where there's a seam. In other words, where there's a combination of water. They'll be right along where the pool forms, and then there's faster water right next to it. So that seam area is really good. If you can slow down a little bit, those jig and minnow combinations are great. Jerk baits are terrific this time of year. That's also for lakes too. Around those same inlet areas that Scott was talking about. But on those moonlit nights or even at night at period on lakes, shallow areas, if there is some current nearby, jerk baits are ideal. Muskies, similar kind of migration, although they generally go later. They'll try and find some of those deep hole areas as well, or at least areas that are out of the main current. Oftentimes, those seeps, in other words, the areas where there is groundwater coming through the banks, is overlooked as a potential draw for both muskies and pike. They concentrate on ambush areas near that slack water. So basically, larger baits tend to produce more strikes overall during the fall. And there's no question that that's true for pretty much any of the game species that we're talking about, these predators.
So Eric and I just put a lot out there about fall fishing, what sort of drives these fish as they get ready for the winter months, the changes that are occurring in lakes and river systems, a little bit on how these populations may move around a little bit and how you might take advantage of them in angling. And obviously there's a lot to be left out there if you're really a novice about gear type and that sort of thing. But it's a pretty good overview. That being said, we wanted to leave a lot of time for questions and answers, kind of coming back to anything we typically do in the Moss seminar series. So at this point, Benji or Jeff, if you want to help out with some questions, we'd love to answer any of them.
Yeah, thanks, Scott and Eric. Really great information. I'm really excited. I think I might have to take a little time off this afternoon and get out there in the lake. It's pretty
I'm gonna
nice
stay
out
today
today.
for that.
Yeah. Andre did ask a question about cast nets and catching shad in Mississippi and Minnesota. Do you have any advice on how to locate those fish or the shad?
I'll take a stab, and maybe Eric, you can give your 2 cents too, but I know it's not for everyone because it requires advanced electronics, but if you have side imaging, even just down imaging or a traditional sonar system, forward-facing sonar, obviously you can locate these schools. But realistically, what you can do if you don't have that equipment is you want to typically maybe start out shallow, moving around, sandbars, beachy areas. If you're looking for dimpling on the water, you're actually looking for schools that are so concentrated that they're creating small dimples. They might be attracting birds if it's a big enough area. You may see other fish crashing in there, some movement on the top of the water. But once you get over there, then you can usually locate a school, or you can attempt. Otherwise, it's just going to good looking areas, throwing the cast net blindly, seeing if you can come into a fish or two here or there. But the better that you can read the water, kind of the more successful you can be if you aren't using electronics to find schools of shad. But electronics definitely speed up the pace. Is there anywhere in your experience, Eric, that you've come across some schools of shad?
I guess it depends on the types of environments we're fishing. You know, I mean, shad down in southern reservoirs like in Texas, they would find the creek arms pretty attractive this time of year. Now, we obviously don't have a lot of that in Minnesota, but the same kind of principle holds true, is that those back coves tend to concentrate some of those fish more often than the wide open spaces of the main lake this time of year anyway. So that's all I can offer. I haven't tried the cast net thing yet either.
Nope.
So
I think you're right on, Eric. A perfectly good example of that sort of creek arm adjacent backwaters. There's a nice beachy area where the Kinnickinnick comes in to the St. Croix that usually does well. There's usually some shad swimming around in that area. So You can also kind of, word of mouth. If you see other sturgeon anglers that are using cast nets, you might ask. I mean, it's not the secret, find your bait club that it sometimes is elsewhere amongst catfish anglers and the sturgeon crowd. They're usually more than willing to help out because they know that that's the key to catching fish many times.
Yeah, and again, just to mention, if anyone has questions, throw those in the Q&A, and there's a great opportunity to learn from some really great anglers. David asks, trout stream maps can be obtained from the DNR, which we have both the Northeast and the Southeast maps, which are really helpful. Are there any maps of streams with smallmouth bass, or how would you locate them without just fishing all the creeks and streams around?
That's a good question. We have some information available in the individual area offices, but I mean, just thinking quickly out loud, obviously the Mississippi is a main corridor. It's got some great fishing, the Rum River, even Crow River, the Crow Wing River, the Sauk River. I mean, there's a whole bunch of rivers within central Minnesota that are phenomenal for smallmouth bass. And you just got to give them a shot. And most of the tributaries that are associated with areas along the Mississippi that have smallmouth bass are also going to have bass. That might be seasonal. So something as that's kind of moderate size, like the Sauk or the Platte, for example, in our area here, they actually become almost void of fish by the time fall migration occurs. So this is really where that knowing that little bit of migration knowledge pays off. But yeah, I would get in touch with any of your area fisheries managers, and they'll be able to point you in the right direction in your local area.
Yeah, and you put your contact information on the slide there, so if folks want to reach out to you, they can do that. But maybe Benji, you could throw up the area office contacts for all the offices across the state. I know we have 30. I mean, there's a lot, right? Area offices where staff are, out on the water. They have a lot of great knowledge of those waters, and are happy to share those. So. And then Scott, actually, maybe you can turn off your slide now too. The presentation, and folks can see us as they're asking questions. Let's talk a little bit more about frogs. I'm in West Central Minnesota, obviously, and grew up in Southern Minnesota. Lots of frogs. What do you look for? And well, first of all, when typically does that happen, the frog migration? And then what do you look for to try and find those locations on lakes where they're migrating?
I'll take a crack at it just because I get to about mid to late September and I'll just come across them. And part of our job is we're out on the landscape doing end of field season type of work, and we just see these huge concentrations, and it really starts to happen by late summer. They kind of stage and hang around, and then by middle to late September, sometimes as late as now with the record warm September. I wouldn't be the least bit surprised if there's a delay in that migration, and it's still occurring right now. But you should. It just is a good pattern that should work for a matter of weeks, not days. It's not like it's all happening in a day or two. It's over a few weeks.
I mean, thinking about predators in general, they're opportunistic, right? So if they see something that looks even remotely close to something that they might have had available at one point, particularly in the fall, they might be able to take advantage of it then too.
And so there are these wetlands that are near lakes, right? Is that kind of the staging at? Is that's what's going on? The frogs are moving from these wetlands that are near. So if you see areas where there's a wetland just outside, like across a road or whatever, and the frogs have to come across the road to get into the lake, that's kind of, well, you mentioned seeing them on roads in the evening, especially damp evenings, is you can definitely see a lot of fish moving. So when you're driving around in your area, you come across an area where you see a wet night or whatever, and you see a bunch of frogs, remember that spot, right?
Yeah, and it's just like you were leading into there, Jeff, or it's just microhabitats. So we're paying attention to, I'm not going to find a lot of frogs or amphibians where it's really rocky and steep-sided shorelines. Probably not, but if I'm adjacent to prairie or wet meadow or wetlands, anywhere that I'm seeing cattails are a good indicator that it's a soft bottom, organic bottom. Those are the places that those amphibians are going to use. So just paying attention.
River backwaters too. I mean, those are key areas for frogs for sure.
I'm going to put you on the spot again about specific prey, and we talked about Cisco, and thanks for mentioning next week's Moss webinar, which will be really fun. And I've never tried netting. I actually caught a couple through the ice, but we're going to talk all things Cisco and the impact that they have on our ecosystems and what they're going through with climate change, but also how to catch them. So that'll be a great way to learn more about ciscos. But the fall spawn, when is that typically happening? Is there a water temperature or time of the year? And then, how, if you know you have a lake with cisco, where are you going to find them spawning, and how should you target the prey that are chasing them?
When it's cold. When it's cold is all I can tell you.
It's like right before ice.
Yes, it generally is right before ice up. So there is a season that is available for on certain lakes for using recreational gill netting, and that's literally right around Thanksgiving most times. And it's in the month of November almost always. That said, it's usually on the types of habitat where these rocky shoals or even gravel type shoals come up shallower, and that's almost always with some form of wind is beneficial, or at least it seems to be. I'm not saying that's 100%. I mean, there's some guys that obviously do the recreational gill netting, probably have a lot more experience in trying to specifically catch ciscos or tullibee in the fall, so as they're spawning. But
so for the predators that are following them, so you're looking at windy points, main points that have some gravel, shoreline, it sounds like, or substrate.
that's been my experience anyway.
Yeah. So then obviously I know some of these lakes that the walleyes, the northerns, even the bass, it's like their prime rib, right? It's the best food, high calorie, and then and they can get these fish congregated in the fall. So you want to do match the hatch, right? Basically, large baits, I guess you were saying.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, at least from my experience, I mean, even stuff like some of the musky guys are throwing these large swim baits, and that works for bass as well as walleye. That's what I would encourage is you do match about the size of the cisco that you might be seeing, or if you can figure that out. But even starting smaller and working your way larger, it can certainly help. I don't know, what's your experience, Scott?
Yeah, no, I would say the same. I was just running through my head Nolan Springler's fish that was the new state record. I thought that was caught on a red October, which is like a large tube swim bait. They're trolling or throwing up on reefs that they know these ciscos are hanging out at, because it's just what you said, Jeff and Eric, of matching the hatch, something that's similar sized, might be shiny, and just taking advantage of that. Those predators are looking at that buffet line, and you want to make sure that you're looking similar, but maybe sticking out a little bit just to attract that bite.
Something to think about though is that fish are truly opportunistic, and they're not that bright. So one of the things that I always point out, whether I'm giving the kids stock or not, is that fish have a small brain. It's usually about the size of the tip of your pinky for a big 26, 28-inch walleye. So don't overthink it too much. I mean, they're reactionary, and oftentimes stuff like a spinner bait is fairly simple bait, or even a spinner, and it doesn't take a perfect match. Oftentimes it's helpful at times, and there are times when color seems to make a difference, but they're not that complicated.
My favorite lure, Eric. It's my favorite lure.
And we actually, we're a bass angler.
Yeah. But it is so easy to use. I mean, if you've never done it, they're easy to cast because there's some heft to them. So even you can use thicker lines. You're not as likely to get broken off. You've got all the big wire on it, so it's harder for a fish to, they're going to grab the back. They're not going to slice it off very often, and they're mostly weedless. So it's just a perfect bait for starters and beginners, and it catch a lot of fish. So.
Sure.
Sorry, I had to go. I had to share that. Yeah, it's my favorite. So, yeah. So, any other questions? Again, drop those in the Q&A. It's any other tips or things you guys want to add? I mean, there's no replacement. I think you've kind of touched on this. I was going to add to just getting on the water, right? You can't duplicate just the experience, the personal individual experience. And I know we all got to work, and it's hard to get out all the other competition in the fall, but you never know when you're going to run into that situation where the fish are, turned on and they're all congregating, and you can really get some big numbers of days and big fish in the fall. So it's a great time.
Yeah, definitely. So one tip that I'll give you is that there are times where it's actually better to fish towards the midday or even towards the afternoon, because as the water cools more, those warmer days tend to be more productive for angling, at least for warm water species, right? So they'll kind of concentrate in some of those areas that are warmer. So those north bays facing southward tend to gather a little bit more heat depending upon which way the wind is blowing and how it's mixing and stuff. But those can actually concentrate fish for short periods. So you might have a morning where you're fishing and it's worthless. You go back in there in the afternoon and all of a sudden there's all kinds of fish available for you, whether it's walleye or bass or pike or even muskies for some places, or crappie too. So it is something to think about. Those warm days that can change the way fishing goes, even within that afternoon time frame. So
yeah, and I think these lakes, especially in the central part of the state with a lot of vegetation, you get these flats with the dark weeds in there and a calm day in the middle of the afternoon, and they can warm up pretty quickly. And I think they can really turn on. I've had a good experience with, again, throwing a spinner bait, covering water, and catching a lot of really big bass on those shallow flats, 5 foot flats or whatever, over the dark weeds.
As hard as it is to get out there for all the reasons that we laid out about all the conflicting things and the busy lives that people lead in the fall of the year, it's you're never going to regret a day out there. I mean, I'm looking at backgrounds that we all have on our pictures here, and it's some of these places that I've seen while out in a fishing boat in the fall are just absolutely magical. I mean, just a few weeks ago I was floating down the Big Fork River, which is in my background here, and caught some small pike and was trying for muskies, moved a couple, but weren't able to hook any. And I had zero regrets for the day. And that was after having to get in and out of a flat bottom boat and push it through some riffles and deal with some low water that we're all dealing with across the state, because it's just such a beautiful setting. I mean, I do the same thing as a deer hunter, or as wading through a sea of grass as a pheasant hunter, or walking through the woods as a rough grouse hunter, or sitting on a marsh as a waterfall hunter, where it's just like you're going to see and experience things that you won't otherwise see sitting on a couch, or, no offense, being in a pumpkin patch or at the football game. So they're fun too, but this is something that is going to be a lifelong memory. So just like
you're not wrong.
Like you teed off on, Jeff, it's just go out and do it. There's no substitute.
Yeah, really good point, Scott. The appreciation is so important, and take time to just, reflect and appreciate that, and give up a little bit of football. I'm trying to do that. So get out there and enjoy this time of the year. We do have another question about Cisco's. Tyler is wondering, is there any movement for people to get Cisco's for bait? A while back, he thought folks could get Cisco, but some of those dealers were not able to do that anymore. Has that been opened up, or will there be an opportunity to get Cisco's? And actually Cisco's, I lived on a lake where there was a lot of Cisco's and you could see them surfacing, but you can't use cast nets. Is there any other way to collect them as bait?
So the best advice I would give for someone that's looking to use Cisco's as bait, you're going to want to purchase your bait and make sure that it's you hold on to your receipt and you get certified disease-free tested. I know there's been quite a bit of focus on that, particularly on lake trout fisheries in the northeastern portion of the state, where Cisco's and other prey items are popular as frozen or packaged or salted minnows. But realistically, definitely check into our regulations. Sean Sizzler oversees our kind of commercial and bait program, so he's the person best suited to answering that question. But that's what I have seen, is that rather than going out and collecting them, if you can find, them in Cisco's in uninfested waters, you can use them absolutely as, for personal consumption. But if they are from infested waters, I believe that you're not able to then use them as bait. So, I'm not the person that would write you the ticket. You want to check. You want to check with conservation officers, or maybe we can put Sean's email in there. It's sean.sisler@state.mn.us, and Sean is uniquely positioned to answer that question, especially with specific water body questions, where that bait may be originating from or going to. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add to that, Eric.
I'm not going to try and tackle that one either. I know that you can angle
Right.
them for personal use, but that's not necessarily for bait. And like Scott said, probably the safest bet at this point is to make sure you have prepackaged and sold bait.
Okay. Well, we are running out of time. Really appreciate you guys coming in and joining us today. Always great information, and we'll definitely try to get you back again.
Hey, just one correction, Jeff, to the email that you posted. Could you take out one of the
Okay.
S's in the middle of the last name? Then you'll have you'll have it.
Thanks for that correction. Yeah, I wasn't positive on that, but I appreciate that. Okay. Thanks, guys. Get out, enjoy. Again, next week we've got Cisco's, our next weekly webinar. And again, this is recorded. So through the DNR YouTube or through our website, mndnr.gov/discover, you can find all of our past webinars. There's a tab actually that you can click on that shows all the past webinars. So in fact, I think a couple that both of you have done in the past on fishing. So we'd love to have you join us next week and get out and enjoy the beautiful outdoors in Minnesota this fall. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.